Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Poverick. I'm the Institute Director. We have a very interesting focus today, the first event of 2021, and in a very appropriate manner, talking about climate change, carbon responses, and government policy towards carbon change and such responses. And the focus today is a discussion of India's climate change policy response and whether India might follow the other leading Asian economies to pledge to become carbon neutral by 2050. Our speakers today are Mr. Alan Rosling, who will be joined for a discussion after Alan's given an opening with Mr. Ed Craig. Alan has, I think, quite exceptional insight into India and especially business in that country from his extraordinary experience as he was chairman of Jardine Matheson Group India and also an executive director of Tata Sons for some time. Alan has also been, during his career, a special advisor in the number 10 policy unit, I understand, a strategic director of United Distillers and CEO of a division of Courtaulds Textiles, as well as a banker at SG Warburg. So Alan, I think headhunters or search executives would call your career eclectic. You've done so many different things in so many industries and obviously so good at all of them. But Roddy could say more about that as a former search executive leader. Really quite an extraordinary career as a business leader, and we're really privileged to have you here to talk with us. In addition, we have Ed Craig, who has been Deputy Director of the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation since 2012. And indeed is one of the co-founders of that entity. He is also Dean, Edinburgh, of the China-UK Low Carbon College, where he leads the University of Edinburgh's overall activity in that area and heads up its innovation and professional education work. Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you very much, Alan, for taking the time today. Alan is calling from Hong Kong, by the way, so his time is a bit later than us. Our host for the discussion to kick off is Roddy Gall, Chairman and the founder of Asia Scotland Institute. And before I hand over to Roddy, if I can just remind everyone the normal rules of engagement. Please could you mute your microphones, disable your camera if you wish. If there's background noise and someone's not muted, we'll mute it for you if someone's inadvertently left their microphone open. I would encourage you to raise questions in the Zoom chat function if you have any during the discussion, either directly to me or to the whole group is fine. And later, when we come to an audience discussion, if you'd like to ask a question directly, we'll enable your audio and camera for you to do so, or I'd be happy to ask the question on your behalf. So please just let me know through the chat. So Roddy, if I may hand over to you, please.
Martin, yes, thank you very much. And from me, good morning from Connecticut, where it's earlier in the day than it is for most of the rest of you. And I'm absolutely delighted that we're hosting this very timely discussion about India and carbon neutrality. I will add too that we are actually tenants of the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation, with which Ed Craig has been very much involved. And this is almost his swan song in public because he's going on shortly to be Vice Principal of Staffordshire University, which I think under his leadership is going to see some significant change. So Ed, good luck to you in the future. Alan and I have known each other for a long time, and he has been a major factor in working in the energy sector, particularly with solar energy, where he relatively recently sold his company and is now involved in other activities. And Alan, it's so good of you to be on this webinar. I'd like to ask you to kick off to talk about what you're doing and how you see the current situation in India in this COVID-19 pandemic situation, and how India is doing relative to other major players in Asia. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Roddy. Back to the economy more generally. And I'm going to link what I'm saying to what my new venture is. So as Roddy mentioned, in 2018, we sold the solar power business, Kiran Energy, that Ardeshir and I had founded in 2010 when I left Tata's. So we were early into the solar business in India. So that's given me a perspective of kind of renewables and clean energy in India. So what I want to say a few things about is the question as to whether India could really make a serious commitment leading up to COP26 this year now. So as we all know, in less than a year, Glasgow is going to be at the center of the universe. Some of you may think it already is, but certainly the first 2 weeks of November, the eyes of the world will be on Glasgow as the UK and Scottish governments host COP26. Now, until recently, we've got used to bad news on climate. People keep telling us there's no way that the Paris commitments are going to be met. Something like a 5% chance was given in 2017 of achieving even the two degrees warming. However, more recently, there's been some better news. Obviously, COVID, already mentioned COVID, means that emissions for the first time ever probably have fallen by about 7% in 2020, estimated. Second good piece of news, if you're a climate believer, of course, is Biden. So the exit of Trump, if he goes quietly next week, and Biden potentially taking the US back into Paris, and certainly making new commitments on climate responsibility, joining something like 120 countries that have already made some sort of commitment around carbon neutrality by 2050. The really big news, though, as Ed will tell us, is that in September, Xi Jinping announced a commitment by China to achieve carbon neutrality, not by 2050, but by 2060. But that is an absolutely massive commitment and change in the outlook, potentially removing something like 10 gigatons of carbon equivalent a year. It will require something like a $15 trillion investment, it's been estimated, and will involve a transformation in the electricity sector in China, which is 75% of their emissions. And remember, they're still building 200 new coal plants there. But also to achieve this, we'll have to do something very radical around new technologies, around carbon capture possibly, and probably around hydrogen as well. So that's the context. Now, what about India? So India is the third largest carbon emitter at the moment. It's about three gigatons of CO2 equivalent a year. And India's emissions have been growing consistently. So since Paris, they're 13% higher, and they've tripled since 1990. India's commitment under Paris was a 30 to 35% reduction in energy intensity of the economy by 2030, but it still almost certainly is an increase in carbon. And estimates are that if the Indian economy grows, as we all hope it will do, unless something new is done beyond the commitments already made, India's emissions may double between now and 2030, up to something like 6 gigatons a year. So India's response to climate really matters because it will become the largest incremental polluter if China does what it says it's going to do, and if Biden does what we hope he's going to do. Now, India has something of a reputation in international negotiations, particularly climate ones, of being the awkward customer. And the current environment minister is on record saying, quote, India did not cause climate change. And India's emissions are only 3% of historical emissions. In October, this minister promised they would resist any new targets for climate action. He said, we will not bow down to any pressure from developed countries on climate change issues. They had committed $100 billion and technology transfer for developing countries, but that has not happened. So India has already kind of laid down a negotiating card before we get to Glasgow. India's historic resistance to any commitments on carbon really comes from three things. First, India genuinely feels climate justice is on its side. India did not cause climate change. India is the largest high-growth democracy in the world. So politically, Indian leaders cannot afford to jeopardize the economic prospects of the people, particularly young people, and especially the middle class, who, like all of us, want to enjoy cars, travel, air conditioners, and so on. Thirdly, India's got huge vested interests in coal. It's the major domestic energy source, jobs, railways, power generation all depend on it, and the state controls most of the plant and the system surrounding it. So all that is the background as to why India would be reluctant to give very radical commitments to carbon reduction. But there are three countervailing things which have changed. First, India now recognizes that it is among the most vulnerable countries to the negative effects of climate change. So rising temperatures, rising sea levels, changes to the monsoon, more intense storms, rains and flooding, water stress, and potentials for getting into disputes with neighboring countries over migration or water use. So India is a victim if we don't do something. Two, technological change. This has been far more rapid than even in 2015 we could have expected. So dramatic changes in the cost of solar, beginning also to happen with battery costs, and the rise of data and connectivity, meaning you can do lots of clever things. Thirdly, India for the last 6 years has been led by a different person. So Narendra Modi became PM in 14. Previously as a CM of Gujarat, he'd led one of the most radically positive climate policies in the country. He even wrote a book on climate change. He's probably the only leader in the world who has written a book about climate change called The Convenient Truth. As PM, he has raised India's ambitious policy. Internationally, he's taken a lead, for example, in the International Solar Alliance. And probably most importantly, Modi is a politician capable of making difficult decisions, capable of thinking long-term, and capable of selling that to his people. After all, he is unchallenged dominant in terms of the political landscape in India. So far, India's climate response has been pretty good by international standards. Started early, 2008, the National Action Plan on Climate Change with 8 sectoral emissions. The one that I know best is solar, where from 2009 onwards, I created a solar business. So India really is the poster boy of the solar world, both in terms of the scale of implementation, the policy development, and the effect. And the effect is down. When I started my first project in India, we were selling power at 15 rupees a kilowatt hour. The latest bid in India is 2 rupees a kilowatt hour. So obviously that's technological change, that's scale, but it's also very, very good policy, well implemented. And there are similarly very positive policy responses around energy efficiency, the encouragement of electric vehicles, etc. So that today, it looks as if India will be the only G20 country that is on track to achieve its Paris NDCs, which of course is only a reduction, I say only, a reduction of 35% in intensity, but still a dramatic change in the shape of the graph that we'd seen before. Now, two more things I want to mention before Roddy grills me and Ed gets at me. The potential for emission reduction. The critical question, I think, is whether it is possible, feasible, economically and socially, to achieve carbon neutrality without sacrificing India's growth agenda. Because with the poverty that India still has, and with the expectations of the middle class, no Indian politician can make that trade-off. I believe it is. It is certainly true that in the energy generation space, which is the largest section, some 40% of emissions, you can decarbonize the Indian economy over the next 30 years with probably a positive effect on the economics of electricity generation. So if solar is now at $2, 2 rupees a kilowatt hour, new coal build would be something like 4 to 5 rupees. Now, obviously the 2 and the 5 are not comparable because you need some storage, but essentially you can move to solar and save. The second area is transport, where again, you are going to see in the next 10 or 20 years, a decarbonization of certainly road transportation, possibly not so quickly aviation and long distance truck haulage, but certainly road transformation will go electric and save money compared to ICE engines. So that leaves the kind of hard to address areas of agriculture, which is about 15% of emissions. In India, we have a lot of cows. and they're holy, and heavy industry. Heavy industry, 25% of emissions, it overlaps a bit with energy use. But like in China, to address these areas, we're going to need very bold policy, carbon taxes, regulation. We're going to need new technology. So the West is going to have to come good on its promises of technology transfer, battery storage, carbon capture, hydrogen, etc. And probably most importantly, we need finance. We need your dollars, ladies and gentlemen. Some work that KPMG did for us in EQ Climate Finance estimates that just to achieve its NDCs by 2030, India needs $3 trillion of investment, 3. So probably to achieve net neutrality over 30 years, 10, 20 trillion dollars of investment. And that is why we've set up EQ Climate Finance as India's first dedicated green finance institution. And maybe we can come back to that a little more in discussion. My last point, Bojo, very popular in Scotland, of course, Mr. Johnson, but he does have an historic opportunity in chairing COP26, one, to do something good for the world, for once, perhaps, but two, to recraft a strategic relationship with India, which frankly, we've been whittling away in an extremely dissolute way. So India, as the largest growing democracy, is a natural partner for the UK. And we've not found ways to dance together in the way which we should have done. Climate change could be one of those facets, along possibly with education, defense, trade, industry, etc. But climate change is in India's interest to address it, and it's in the UK's interest for India to address it. So coming up to COP, I would like to see the UK government making a strategic commitment to give Modi something of what he wants, which is finance and technology, in order to get from Mr. Modi what we want, which is a commitment for India to become carbon neutral by the mid-century. Thank you, Roddy. Those are what I wanted to say. Do you want me to come back to the general COVID situation, or do you want to ask me questions?
I'm going to ask you a question now, Alan, and then we're going to get Ed to as well. So I was very interested in what you had to say about the internal combustion engine, which was your reference to ICE, I think, particularly since I think it was last week I read that Tesla were actually opening in India with a plant to build cars there. And that's a fascinating indication of the direction things are going in. One of the huge challenges that we all know India has is creating enough jobs for these substantial numbers of people who are aged under 25, most of whom are unemployed, or many of whom are. And I'd just like you to comment on what you see as the opportunities for engaging with people to create new jobs in the new infrastructure that will be needed, if you could comment on that. And then I'd like you to just make a side reference to the Biden administration that's coming in, which looks as if it will act more favorably with India, and of course is committed with Kerry to getting back involved with the Paris Accord. So 2 questions: jobs for the boys and girls, and how to deal with the US and whether there's going to be a significant change there.
Yeah, well, jobs is a critical challenge. 1 million young people a month come on the job market in India.
Yeah.
And obviously at a time of COVID, when a lot of the service jobs have been badly affected, it's even worse in terms of underemployment, unemployment, and the prospects for young people. So I think greenery generally is an area where job creation is going to be enormous. If you take my numbers, own something like $3 trillion of investment required just to hit the NDCs, which are relatively achievable, and maybe 5 times that or something to achieve net neutrality, that is an awful lot of new something. A lot of that new something will be distributed. So, solar, of course, will be very large centralized plants in the Rajasthan desert pumping into the national grid, employing 1,000 people to build them and 30 people to run them. But it will also be distributed solar, modular solar all over the country, creating thousands of jobs. India's had a revolution in terms of e-commerce. So service jobs, delivery jobs, all those guys on 2-wheelers. You mentioned Tesla. India's not a car market in in this context, is a two-wheeler market or even a three-wheeler market. All of that will be electrified. And many of these two and three-wheelers are owned by young men, typically men, who own the vehicle and are contracted to Amazon or Flipkart or the restaurant delivery guys. And this is an absolutely incredible source of jobs. And if we can then take that decarbonization into the rural economy, even more jobs will be created. So I think, as elsewhere, greenery generally is a jobs opportunity of a massive scale as you build that infrastructure and the new economy. Turning to Biden and Kerry. Kerry knows India very well, of course. When he was Secretary of State, he worked quite hard on India. And I think it's all good news so far. I mean, the Democrats typically have not been as bold in their India policy as the Republicans, strangely. After all, it was Blackwell and Bush who changed the relationship with India, not Clinton, despite the fact Clinton was popular in India. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether Biden's other priorities and trade-offs mean that he's not quite as open to doing something special for India as Trump could have been if Trump did very much on India, which he didn't. But I think clearly Biden's commitment to climate change, the party's commitment to climate change, and Kerry's appointment to be the ambassador for greenery, it's all great news for all of us relative to what we've seen in the past.
Alan, thanks. I think I'll ask Ed if he'd like to ask you a question or two, and then we'll move on to Martin.
Indeed, and I think we've got some really interesting people attending today who I know will be desperate, who are operating in India as well, would like to ask questions. But I'm going to cut to the chase as someone, Alan, who's set up this new initiative, having had such a and will continue to have a stellar career. You're focusing on the E-Cube climate finance, about how to engage and identify finance and deal with this $1 trillion question. So where do you start, Alan? We're talking about deepening the engagement with the UK. We're talking about learning from other countries. Where would you start? Where would the smart money go for the next year and the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay, so where we're starting is actually in the UK. Hopefully our anchor investor, I hope, and it's yet to be confirmed, is we're hopefully if we're going to be UK institutions, that makes us part of this new relationship between the UK and India. So where we're going to start is first raise our money, then get our banking license or non-banking finance license, NBFC license. What we're going to focus on is the areas of climate energy transition, which is underbanked. The area that I used to play in, which is large scale solar, is relatively easy to raise finance. If you have a decent PPA with an off-taker who's bankable, it's perfectly easy to raise debt finance and to sell your plant or to securitize the asset, whatever it is. So the problem is not in large-scale grid connect electricity generation for wind or solar. The problem lies in a number of areas. Strangely for India, green buildings, where because real estate has got such a terrible reputation in India, raising capital for real estate projects, green or not, is an issue. So we want to have an allocation of something like 25% to green buildings, which is going to be a significant carbon saving. Number two is relatively small renewable energy for industrials and captives moving into SMEs. So we want to democratize solar. Number three is energy efficiency in industry, reduction of just about everything, just reinstalling HVAC systems, electric motors, water, because it's not just doing carbon, but also water and waste, all of that. So energy efficiency across industry. And the last area is EVs. And the problem with financing electric vehicles is it's very hard when you don't have a secondary market and it's unknown exactly what the life characteristics of a battery is. So we're going to have to come up with some innovative solutions as to how to finance those guys on electric motorcycles delivering your pizza and your Flipkart order.
That's fascinating, Alan. Can I say that perhaps an immediate comment is one thing you've not mentioned is waste, water waste, and into the circular economy, which also may present a significant job creation or job securement opportunity. Is that something you're looking at as India develops as economy naturally? potentially more waste and more pollution will be resultant?
Yes, it is. The problem with water and waste is the business model is more difficult for us to see and therefore to finance. So we found some ways of doing it. And India's regulations mean that certain industries have to make the investments regardless. So industries will be making the capex, even though it's OPEX increasing rather than reducing. So ZLD plants, water recovery plants, recovery of waste, plastics, and so on, all of that. Waste to energy is an area that you could say is waste, or it could be energy. India's got a very vibrant energy generation and now biogas industry developing quite fast. Again, government supported by offtake arrangements for the oil marketing companies. So all of that is in our mix, but the economics of those projects more difficult to see than the energy projects and the EV financing. Therefore, only when we get sources of international capital and risk sharing, which enables us to do things which are more difficult to justify on pure economic grounds without concessionary financing. But once we get that concessionary financing from the DFIs and the multilaterals, then certainly you're right, water, waste, and increasingly small projects, more retail projects for more ordinary people and small businesses.
Alan, can I just leap in here and ask, with your former Tata experience, I always thought it was a great pity that when the Nano was launched, it was not launched as an electric vehicle. And the Tata Group does have such an influence in India. Are they along for the ride too? Do you hear that they are committed to working in the area that we're talking about? Absolutely.
It's actually a lot of the work on electric was done, certainly my time in the Tatas, which was a while ago, in the UK, following the acquisition of Jaguar and the work that Tata Motors was doing with Warwick. They created a centre of excellence in the UK, a lot of which was focused on electric, partly, of course, because of the challenge to diesels in Land Rovers. But in India, yes, as I understand it, they're doing a lot of work. They've got a range of electric buses out already. The critical thing from my point of view is they have a small delivery vehicle called the ACE, which is a kind of a micro delivery van, kind of Japanese standard. That is the one that I'd love to see electrified, because last mile delivery is the easiest to electrify, not the intercity stuff. So, electrifying long distance buses and long distance trucks, much harder because of charging. But if all you're doing is running between a warehouse and city centre drop-off points, and you've got a charging point in your warehouse, that's perfect for electrification.
Thank you very much. Martin, I'd like to pass over to you now to let some other people in with questions, and then Ed, we'll come back to you later on again.
Roddy, thank you very much. Ed, we do have a growing number of questions, so I think we'll take as much as your time. We'll use your time very well. Could I ask Roger Jeffrey if you'd like to come on? Roger, are you okay to enable your microphone and camera? Thank you, Roger.
Yeah, thanks very much, Martin, and thank you, Alan, for the very interesting, stimulating discussion so far. I don't know anything about the finance side. I come from a longer-term connection to India, and my question really is about the fact that you've focused on the carbon challenge, and you keep switching between carbon and climate change, as if carbon and climate change are the same thing, but you haven't really talked about other compounds that change the climate, and I'm particularly interested in nitrogen ones, which are also threatening the environment, human health, etc., in various ways, reactive nitrogen. And I'm asking this question because I'm part of the South Asian Nitrogen Hub, which is a large research project based in Edinburgh, which is trying to put nitrogen on the agenda, on the global agenda at COP26, as well as in other places, and is pretty successful in doing so on the science side, but doesn't have engagement of people like you or other civil society organizations to wake up to the impact that nitrogen has on air quality, on water, on greenhouse gases, on ecosystem services and soil. You can turn that into wages, which is a rather nice acronym to keep you going. So the question is really, is your work open to contributing to addressing the challenge of reducing nitrogen emissions by 50% by 2050, which is a prospect that India helped to sponsor at the unfortunately greatly truncated UNEP 2020 earlier last year.
Okay, well, thank you, Roger. So yes, I mean, I'm using loose language to say carbon equivalent or whatever in terms of it's the way that we business folk tend to think of it. Nitrogen, I think that certainly in the Indian context, much less focus. The two areas that I've come across discussion of NOx, which I guess is one of the aspects that you're talking about, is around electricity generation and particulate and emissions from chimneys, and what can be done to remove it. And the same out of pipes of ICE engines. But particularly the debate has been around power stations and other large energy users, power stations in particular. And the shocking thing to me is that India introduced some regulations a number of years ago. The courts were endorsed it, and there's just been slippage. You know, even I read, I think last month, that again, the government-controlled electricity system is lobbying for the NOx and SOx and particulate regime to be slipped again, because they don't want to make the investment in the systems to take the stuff out, reduce the emissions, in even relatively low levels of investment, never mind into full desulfurization. So I think it's not been an area of focus. I have to say I don't understand it as well. I mean, I tend to, you know, like everybody else, I use the language loosely, and we talk about carbon equivalent. I understand that's got some other greenhouse gases in and so on, but in policy terms, it's not been an area of focus other than air quality. And air quality is really where it's been hitting, and therefore health, and particularly obviously it's Delhi. But you know, the farmers are more powerful politically, as we're seeing at the moment, than middle-class people who want to breathe the air. So governments tend to slip and not do what they should do.
I hope that answers your question. No response there, but
he was being polite, I think. I think
yes,
he was demonstrating my ignorance.
letting you off the hook.
So Jeffrey, I think we should, Roger, sorry, we should have a separate conversation and you can educate me on this.
Well, I'll certainly do what I can. One of the bits of our project is actually working on the attempts to extract nitrogen from power plants in the same way that it's possible to do carbon capture. So yeah, I think there are opportunities there. Yeah.
But the problem again is that'll be negative in terms of OPEX, I mean, increasing OPEX. So you have to do it through regulation.
Yeah, and I think the ideas about regulation in this field are rather old-fashioned, shall we say.
Right. Okay, look forward to a conversation. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Roger, and for the answer, Alan. We have a regular attendee and contributor who's asked to speak. Sunil, would you like to come on?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Roddy. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Ed, for this very interesting presentation and discussion. I have to say at the outset that 2020 was a very interesting year, and myself and my family have been lucky and fortunate to have been embarrassingly comfortable, as I say that, you know, and I hope, I mean, considering the travels of people around the world, and I hope 2021 is better for everybody. Now, having said that, I just want to quickly refer to what Roddy was talking about Tata's, and they have just, in fact, at the same time as the Tesla announcements came, Tata's have launched a EV called eVision. So I just wanted to mention that. Going to, I mean, asking Alan or Ed a comment or a question. I mean, I think India and China are inextricably linked for historically from 1800 onwards. If you see, we are a parallel economy going from 1800 right until 1990, when China took off and India kind of didn't take off. So between 1990, in the last 30 years, China had just gone tremendously ahead. Now, you said many things about, I mean, you alluded to China, but you said something about India, about population and the, you know, employment, etc., need of employment. But our population is on the rise. China has already hit the inflection and their population is on the fall. And they're already up there economically and per capita income and, you know, absolute poverty and all that, you know, so they're all positive in that direction, whereas India is still very much negative in that direction. Now, whenever USA is, I have no particular, things about US, because no US government has been positive to India in that sense. But let's say what you say about Biden might be true. But Biden's focus, I think, in his first term, and I don't know whether he'll get a second term or not, but in his first term is going to be focusing on China, where Trump has caused a lot of damage with Chinese relations. In fact, very recently, literally in his swan song, Trump's upped the status of Taiwan, making China even more unhappy. So I think Biden is going to be focusing more on China again, as everybody else has done so far, including UK or any other country, for obvious reasons, because they have where the business is. They are where the business is. So I don't know whether India is going to benefit from this new situation. So I just wanted to hear your comment on that. And also at the same time, how is, China says 2060, which is less realistic, but India saying 2050 might be even more less realistic in my view. So I just wanted to get your comments on that, and perhaps Ed might want to say something as well. Thank you.
Okay, so Sunil, thank you for the question. Let me just say a few things, and then Ed no doubt will come in. First of all, I should say I'm speaking from Hong Kong. So this is a live link to Hong Kong. Therefore, you also are privy to the national security law, just like I am. But so I have to be careful what I say. Clearly, India and China are, you're absolutely right, intricately linked, and yet the trade is ridiculously small. And the trade between India and China is tiny. It's something like $90 billion a year. It's skewed in one direction. Investment flows were beginning to pick up before the standoff that's happened in the last couple of years, particularly in the last, since the Ladakh and the border incidents. So it's a ridiculous situation where these two great rising powers are really not trading and investing in each other's economies in the way which they should have done, in my view. Now, India, it seems to me, could potentially benefit from a lot of these global forces. If one of the things we've learned from COVID is that supply chains need to be more robust and not dependent on a single geography, where else in the world could you start producing things at scale with low cost and very talented people and so on? India, Make in India is one of Modi's strategies. It would seem to me that now is the moment to make in India real. Strategically, with a lot of talk in this part of the world about the Quad, India's relationships with the US, with Japan, with Australia. Just today, I've heard some news about India getting hold of one of the ports in Colombo, again, a sort of anti-Chinese move. So India could also benefit from, if US and China are going to have more tension than they've perhaps in the last 30 years, India relatively could be a beneficiary of that. So as the other economy and the other large block of people and rising growth of GDP in Asia, there could be ways that Modi and his successors, if they play their cards right, could benefit from the sorts of geostrategic and geoeconomic factors that Sunil, you've been talking to. So yes, I think it is an opportunity for India. Now is, not least because of our young people, now is India's century. China's had its growth. It's our turn now.
Okay, let me add a few points onto that. I could speak for the rest of the session. I'll just keep it brief. China clearly has a huge opportunity and a huge advantage in its centralization. To give you an example, through our center in Shanghai, the government instructed the directors of all 31 provinces to come to learn about, over 2 weeks, carbon management, carbon finance, and it was a 3-line whip, and they were there and off they went to enable and engage and process. And obviously it's a significant challenge to replicate that. However, what China does lack, which India, I believe, has in spades, is the ability to innovate, to be entrepreneurial, to be creative. It's much more planned and static in a Chinese perspective, requiring and responsive to importing that creativity and then replicating and scaling. And I think India has a huge role to play. So that's one. Secondly, we know that India has a very large population within the United States. We know that America will be seeking strong and stable long-term partnerships to continue its influence in the region. We know that China is being increasingly classified as a potentially not that partner of choice. Therefore, I think it's up to Modi and Biden to look to the future and say, right, how can we ensure that we're creating a stable and sound platform to build a long-term partnership base? And I believe India has a very, very strong opportunity to do that going forward, especially as China is increasingly seen as the longer-term threat. And thirdly, I would just ask everyone, when China has embraced the Belt and Road, it has made its significant geopolitical economic play. What is India doing to replicate that? And is it always playing it will always be compared to China in unfairly in many cases, but what initiatives as a significant market, as a significant player, what is India doing to announce itself to the world stage to say, this is what we are approaching, how we would like to influence, and trying to shape the dialogue and not just simply react to whoever comes to India coming in? That would be my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ed. Could we move on? The time is spinning on, and I'd like to give Dominic Ashmole a chance. If Dominic, you're ready to. I think Dominic has something of a Greta Thunberg question for you, if I could put it that way.
Yeah, I really appreciated the presentation, really interesting, and I preface my remarks by saying I don't claim to have any knowledge, particular knowledge of India or any right to an opinion, but it's a more general question. Obviously, there's lots of controversy in climate science, but I was reading today, for example, a recent paper, January paper, suggesting that global heating is likely within 20, 30 years to reach the point where the main forest sinks, carbon sinks, degrade to the point that they're no longer functional. And that the consequences of that would be very rapid runaway climate change happening in the second half of the century. So if you suspend if you accept that that's a possibility, where does all this discussion of targets of 2050, 2060 for net zero, where do you end up with that? And I guess a supplementary question would be, I know that McKinsey, for example, and others have spoken about the necessity for natural-based solutions to carbon mitigation, particularly large-scale afforestation or protection of forest. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that. I mean, yes, it is a bit of a Greta question, but part of me listens to these conversations and kind of goes, will this have any real relevance given the climate science or some of the climate science that is being shared? Thank you.
Okay, Dominic, thank you. I mean, I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't want to comment on the science of it. I mean, obviously, we in India are doing enough to our forests without climate doing it for us. So we're degrading and cutting down and otherwise depleting forest cover. Part of the commitments in Paris for India made was to plant quite a lot of additional new forest cover. And I suspect that will be, again, coming into COP26, if India does something, that sort of reforestation will be part of it. But I mean, as I said in my remarks, I think India is among the most vulnerable countries to a whole range of climate effects, of which, I mean, the effects of deforestation may be one, but the more immediate ones are sea level rise. There are 3 mega cities which are less than a meter from the sea level, one of which I lived in for many years and it's my Indian home, plus Calcutta, plus Madras. So you could have, 60 million people just affected by flooding from the sea, water shortages in other ways, monsoon changes. Most of our agriculture is still dependent on the pattern of the monsoon. So if there's any fluctuation to that. So all of this is way before we get to the middle of the century. The other point to make is we all understand that it's not achieving net neutrality by 2050, 2060 or any other number. We only have a limited carbon budget, which I guess maybe Ed can tell us more about. So if we pollute up to 2038 and then stop, that's not good enough. We have to make deep cuts straight away in the next few years in order to achieve, holding to even 2%, 2 degrees rather, and never mind the 1.5. Dominic, the thrust of your question is exactly taken. This is really serious for all 1.3 billion Indians, all 2 billion people on the subcontinent who are kind of linked together by the system. And therefore, all of us have got to do something very radical, very fast, not just to save the forests, but also to save ourselves.
Briefly, Dominic, this is terrifying, and it's not just simply forests, but also the seas. We had a fantastic talk from Howard Dryden just recently talking about the impacts there. Roddy had made the link here earlier to a question regarding COP, and also there was a question about the prioritization of carbon versus nitrogen versus other aspects, looking at the climate crisis in its broadest sense. I think COP presents a huge opportunity for us to work in advance to bring these issues to the fore, so that COP isn't just simply climate change business as usual, talking about technology advancement, talking about energy transition and other issues, but real issues regarding the degradations of our forests and our seas as well. And I know there's prior events happening, both hosted in China and other parts of the world in advance to do that, but this has to come to the fore in a much stronger and clearer way. Otherwise, this decade, never mind the century of India, this decade will be the decade of the planet. So yes, I totally endorse your question, Dominic.
Oh,
Dominic.
response, yeah.
I think that puts the entire discussion into perspective, actually. So it's a very timely and important question. Could I pull that down to earth just a little bit with a more mundane question, if I could, and especially as most of our constituents and supporters come from business and academia largely. So what you've said, Alan, and what you talked about, Ed, how does that relate to Scotland and the UK, especially economically? I think we can see from Ed, your work with Edinburgh University, Scotland produces great thought leaders and the insight into the problems, contributing to solving those problems especially. But economically, what are the opportunities for Scotland and the rest of the UK to contribute to solving these problems? Could you say anything about that?
Again, yeah, briefly, happy to. I think Scotland's at the forefront regarding policy development and policy implementation. We have a fantastic centre called the Centre for, it's gone out of my head now, CXC's Climate Exchange Centre, dealing with the formation of and implementation of new policy and bringing forward. A lot of these questions when you're dealing with national governments comes down to where can we start that engagement? How can we change the policy to enable business to engage? So that's one aspect. Secondly, we have a range of fantastic thought leaders, both academically on the technology side. We've mentioned carbon capture and storage and hydrogen as a huge area of established knowledge, which could be linked with policy, could be looked at quite seriously, not just simply in China, but also in India. And thirdly, something which is coming more and more where Scotland, as well as the UK, is looking as a thought and implementation leader is circular economy and waste and water treatment. The leadership of Zero Waste Scotland, the development of new circular economy business models, I believe is something which will drive leadership globally. So I see those areas as established leadership. But I mean, Alan was mentioning the built environment before. There are so many opportunities that are already in existence that we can implement. And I was at COP in Paris, as well as COP in Madrid. And I know back in Paris, they were talking about that we had 65 to 70% of the solutions already available to make the Paris targets. That must now be near 85, 90%, if only we can create the partnerships and create the stable platforms and policies to allow that exchange to happen. The technologies and the solutions can flow, if complemented, Alan, of course, by the finance.
If I can just answer the question in a slightly different way, which is this. I've spent 30 years trying to persuade the UK to build a different and deeper relationship with India, a kind of new special relationship. And I get so frustrated with UK business who tell me, oh, you know, India's so difficult, and it's, you know, we went to India and we had a problem with a joint venture partner, whatever it is. The UK, particularly post-Brexit, is desperate for a partner like India. We need them. And we've got so much to add. Already we start as the biggest investor in the country, right? Because of history, we've inherited this stock of investment in India, We're the biggest employer of any foreign investor, way ahead of the Americans or the Chinese or the Japanese. Every British company you can think of, including good Scottish companies, has got major presences in India, whether it be Vodafone or with HSBC, Diageo. Everyone is there. Reckitt, Unilever, Shell, BP, they're all in India. But we're losing our position. And there are so many things that we could do. The problem is we send ministers out who come out, they start talking about, oh, the English language and cricket and shared values. And young Indians roll their eyes because they weren't in Cambridge in the 1950s and they don't remember Uncle Nehru. So we've got to be talking the language of the future. And we've got to be talking to this government, which is a nationalist government, which has little interest in historical connections with the UK and so on. The Modi government is about India first. So what is it that Mr. Modi wants? He wants infrastructure built. So where is the City of London in infrastructure building in India? They want to develop science and research. So where are the UK research institutions? And I've done quite a lot of work with my alma mater at Cambridge in terms of doing stuff with India. So we know there's so much to be done. Defense and collaboration over intelligence, terrorism, and so on. Modi is now, particularly with the standoff in China, desperate for, to build up the manufacturing base, the technology base, and reshaping the armed forces. What better partner could there be than British Aerospace, or Cobham, or the UK government for all of these areas? So I think we need a completely different type of relationship. And it just seems to me climate fits right there in the middle. With the technology and the knowledge we have, the leadership, the thought leadership, as Martin said, the finance that we have coming out of the city and out of Edinburgh, we really need some imagination and leadership on this. And climate has got to be right in the center of it.
Alan, thank you very much, and Ed, thank you. I think you should be directing UK trade policy, actually, Alan. That's sort of summed up many problems, but also why our approach to the world should be refreshed. We can't keep talking about.
Well, remember, India's taking over now. Now we have Mr. Sharma running the COP process. We have Mr. Sunak who's running the country. Bojo, of course, until he got divorced, was married into an Indian family. So there's in Downing Street, there's plenty of Indianness about.
Exactly. It should have an impact. Roddy, could I hand back to you for a few closing remarks?
Indeed, thank you very much indeed. And of course, yes, the Chancellor is the son-in-law of Narayana Murthy, which of course is interesting, one of the founders of Infosys. So, as you say quite correctly, the Indian influence in the United Kingdom is significant, very significant. Ed and Alan, thank you both so much. This has been a hugely timely look at a very, very important area. And as Martin has said, that was a splendid call to arms to the United Kingdom to get off its backside and actually start doing something instead of issuing from time to time platitudes. Huge opportunity for doing business, which I hope that we will embrace. And as you said, Mr. Kerry from the United States, he knows India very well. And that is, I think, a very auspicious development. So on behalf of everybody on this call, thank you for participating. Thank you for your hugely interesting comments. And I'm sure we'll come back and visit this subject again. And in the meanwhile, for Roger Jeffrey, do let us know more about the South Asia nitrogen hub. We would love to talk about that as one of our events coming up. And we look forward to seeing all of you again soon. So again, Alan, thank you so much. Ed, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our future events, all of you, very soon. Martin, thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks, Ed. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.